The ballad of the Battle of Newland seems to refer to a battle of 1541 between Wakefield men sent by Henry VIII and Sir Richard Rich to evict the Knights Hospitallers from their Newland commandery. There was no such battle in 1541, so what could be the truth about this ballad, and the fact that no trace of it can be found before its publication in 1790? What was going on in Wakefield and Newland in the 1780s and 90s? In 1541, Henry VIII was frightened Wakefield people wanted to assassinate him, so he diverted his royal progress route to York to avoid Wakefield. That conspiracy was betrayed, and the conspirators executed. In the 1780s and 90s, the era of the publication of the ballad, our king was now George III, with excellent reason to be very frightened. The American and then the French revolutions were raging, treason too close to home. In the 1780s and 90s, working people in America, France and Britain had similar grievances, and one was tax. Remember, in 1541, tax in economic distress had been a big complaint in Yorkshire. By 1795, King George had to raise taxes to pay for wars abroad, particularly against the American colonies. It didn't help that he lost that war. In Britain, country people were moving to factories and mills in the towns to live in slum-like conditions. Nearby, houses like this Westgate mansion of one of the Milnes family, Wakefield's merchant princes, stood proudly snubbing their poor neighbours. Starvation stalked the poor. Exports of woolen cloth had collapsed. Workers were being laid off. Steam-powered machinery was wiping out jobs. From summer 1794 onwards, owing to the French Revolution, there were no cheap grain imports from Europe. A loaf of bread cost a worker's weekly wage. Wakefield's death rate rose by 30%. Riots for food broke out. On the 15th of June 1795, Pemberton Milnes, a prominent local merchant, wrote requesting permission from the Secretary of State for War for orders to call out the volunteer militia, saying, "The general discontent in the minds of the common people is a very great and alarming on account of the high price of corn. My request is that you be pleased to give orders to the commanding officers to be ready to aid the civil magistrates to quell any riotous proceedings that may arise, to act as military reserves in case of French invasion, but also to keep the peace against revolution in Britain." Local militia had been set up under the Militia Acts of 1782 to 1783. In Wakefield, on the 19th of May 1794, Town Constable Benjamin Kennett called a meeting of the clergy, gentlemen and merchants, traders and respectable merchants of the town, to form for the purposes of forming a volunteer corps for the internal defence of this town and neighbourhood, against insurrection or any commotion. Of 167 men enrolled in 1795, there was not a single labourer. They were gentlemen, professionals like lawyers or manufacturers and artisan tradesmen. Here they are at their review in 1795 on Heath Common. The post office's local postmasters also collected information on potential revolutionaries at home, spying on what people were saying in private letters. Like King Henry VIII had been, King George was on the lookout for traitors. With reports sent to London and the mail of suspects intercepted and turned over to the government, this resulted in the largest number of trials for sedition and treason in British history. On the 21st of May 1792, the King issued a proclamation against seditious writings, commanding all magistrates to make diligent inquiry in order to discover the authors and printers of such wicked and seditious writings. Neither private correspondence or published works were free from scrutiny. A variety of suppressive acts were passed between 1793 and 1801 to prevent revolution breaking out here as it had in France. To avert revolution, rioting and disorder in Britain, the government had brought grain from America. Town relief committees pleaded for access. In Wakefield, the grain would have to be transported from Hull along the Aire and Calder Navigation, right past poor people who were starving. This was too much of a temptation, and the barges became obvious targets for emerging organised activists, such as the underground army known as the Black Lamp, to seize grain for the starving. On the 4th of August 1795, late at night, a grain barge was stopped by the Black Lamp at Kirkthorpe Lock, just after Newland and before it reached Heath. Simultaneously, barges were stopped at Nottingley, Castleford and Leeds. Not a spontaneous event, but one weeks in the planning. as grain barges stopped at Heath Lock, circled on the canalised portion of the River Calder near Wakefield. A crowd storms the barges. The Barnsley Yeomanry, led by Sir John Spencer Stanhope of Cannon Hall, moved to Heath. Stanhope charged his 60 cavalry into the crowd, who fled downriver to Newland Ford. There the loyal Stanley Volunteers opened fire and the crowd were dispersed. On the 5th of August, Pemberton Milnes orders the Royal Wakefield Volunteers to march to Nottingham to disperse the rioting there. The Riot Act was read. Soldiers and civilians battled for possession of a grain barge. 20 were wounded, 5 arrested, including 2 women, at Nottingham and Newland. The Royal Wakefield Volunteers returned to Wakefield that evening triumphant, expecting to be hailed as heroes, and their leader, Pemberton Pem Milnes, addressed them as Wakefield's loyal and true blues. The townspeople think differently. Stones and turds are thrown at him and the volunteers outside the Moot Hall on Kirkgate. The volunteers turned tail, and Pemberton fled to Wexgate's Pemberton House, whose windows were smashed. So could our 1790 ballad be a satire like television's Spitting Images? Is the author using the real-life dissolution of the monasteries in 1541 by King Henry and Richard Rich as a cover against being sued for slander for making fun of the local gentry from Wakefield? The ballad was of course published too early to parody this real-life battle near Newland in 1795. But in this era, the same Wakefield elite who grossly misjudged this situation were clearly ripe for mockery and parody. Similar tinderbox political conditions and satirical publications existed which could prove a match for our ballad. Can we identify the real players in this saga, and who was who in the ballad from the events of the 1780s and 90s? Why was the ballad written, and who was the author, P.W.?